Next, we're going to go over embryology with Tahmid Chaudhry.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So before we start, I would like to point out that most of the stuff that I'm talking about was discovered when ultrasound was first discovered by scientists. This was in the 1950s. So if you think about it, it's a 1,200-year difference. So this is comparing when it was actually discovered to when it was revealed in the Quran. So we will start off by talking about a leech-like substance. So on page 20, there's a Quranic ayah, and I will read it. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلقه خلق الإنسان من علق. Proclaim or read in the name of thy Lord and Cherisher, who created man out of a mere clot of congealed blood. So the key words here are clot of congealed blood. So it's an analogy to how a zygote forms. So a zygote is basically the precursor to the embryo. So there are two gametes. The first is the female egg, and that develops in the ovaries in the female reproductive system. And then we also have the male gamete, which is the sperm, and that's produced in the testes in the male reproductive system. So these two gametes, they form and they basically join together in the fallopian tubes in the female reproductive system, and it forms the zygote, and that's what the clot of congealed blood refers to. Next, we will talk about drop emitted from between the backbone and the ribs. So once again, this is talking about sperm in the male reproductive system. So I will read another ayah. فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ مِمَّا خُلِقَ خُلِقَ مِن مَّاءٍ دَافِقٍ يَخْرُجُ مِن بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ. Now let man bethink from what he is created. He is created from a drop emitted, proceeding from between the backbone and the ribs. So when it says between the backbone and the ribs, it's talking about the male reproductive system where sperm is actually created. So in the testes, the sperm, in order to be ejaculated through the urethra, it goes through a bunch of different structures inside the male reproductive system. So for example, it goes through this narrow tube known as the vas deferens, and ultimately the sperm, it enters the female reproductive system through this special substance. It's called semen. And in order to create semen, you not only need sperm, but you also need other materials. So you need sugars, water, salt, and all of these are basically acquired through these special glands that are found in the male reproductive system. There are three of them in particular that I'll talk about. So the first is the bulbourethral gland, the second is the seminal vesicles, and the third is the prostate gland. So these three glands are responsible for creating semen, which combines with sperm and ultimately allows these tiny sperms, millions of sperms, to enter, and ultimately one will be the one that fertilizes the egg that's formed in the ovaries. Okay, so now we will talk about the fetus protected by three veils of darkness. So I will read another ayah. يَخْلُقُكُمْ فِي بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ خَلْقًا مِّن بَعْدِ خَلْقٍ فِي ظُلُمَاتٍ ثَلَاثٍ. He makes you in the wombs of your mothers in stages, one after another, in three veils of darkness. So we will talk about these three veils of darkness that are mentioned here. So there are three, and the first one is the anterior abdominal wall of the mother. So in the fetus, or the fetus basically forms the fetal pelvis in this area, and that's basically the part that connects the leg to the rest of the body of the fetus. Next we have the uterine wall. So as stated before, this is where the egg and the sperm actually join together, and it's implanted here, and it ultimately develops into the embryo. And three, we have the amniochorionic membrane. So it's basically a complex layer of sacs that protects the embryo. It also feeds it and gets rid of waste. So there are four sacs in particular that I will talk about. So the first one is the chorion, and the chorion is like the outermost sac, and it's responsible for gas exchange that occurs, so oxygen and carbon dioxide, and this is between the embryo and the mother. Next we have the amnion. So the amnion is the sac that actually provides fluid that the embryo is housed in, and that's where it stays and it doesn't really move. Next we have the allantois. So the allantois is responsible for housing some of the metabolic wastes and things that the embryo excretes, and it's basically stored there. And the last thing is the yolk sac, and the yolk sac is basically a sac that provides food for the embryo as it develops. Okay, so next we will talk about the embryonic stages, and I will read another Quranic verse. وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ ثُمَّ خَلَقْنَا النُّطْفَةَ عَلَقَةً فَخَلَقْنَا الْعَلَقَةَ مُضْغَةً فَخَلَقْنَا الْمُضْغَةَ عِظَامًا فَكَسَوْنَا الْعِظَامَ لَحْمًا ثُمَّ أَنشَأْنَاهُ خَلْقًا آخَرَ فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. Man we did create from a quintessence of clay. Then we placed him as a drop of sperm in a place of rest, firmly fixed. Then we made the sperm into a clot of congealed blood. Then of that clot we made a fetus lump. Then we made out of that lump bones and clotted by bones with flesh. Then we developed out of it another creature. So blessed be Allah, the best to create. Okay, so we will go through each of these processes that were mentioned here. So first it says a drop of sperm in a place of rest firmly fixed. So this refers to sperm and egg forming and eventually turning into the zygote, which is the clot of congealed blood that is mentioned here. Then it says the clot, we made a fetus lump. So there are four different stages that a zygote goes through in order to ultimately form into an embryo. So the first one is blastulation, and blastulation is basically a process where the zygote ultimately undergoes mitosis. So if you're not sure what mitosis is, it's basically when the zygote, when this one cell splits into two, and those two cells split into four. So it's this continuous process until ultimately you have this ball of cells, and this process is known as cleavage. So next in the process, we go through something called gastrulation. So gastrulation is a process where we ultimately end up with a hollow ball of cells, and this hollow ball of cells ultimately turns into 3 germ layers that basically create the different parts or different structures in our body. So we have the endoderm. So the endoderm is basically the innermost germ layer, and it's responsible for creating many of the organ systems that we have. Next we have the mesoderm, and it's responsible for making things like the bones that we have. And lastly we have the ectoderm, so it's the outermost germ layer, and it's responsible for creating the skin and the brain. Next, it says we will make out of that lump bones and clotted the bones with flesh. So once again, the mesoderm, it's responsible for this. It basically creates the bones and the flesh, and then we developed out of it another creature. So ultimately you end up with an embryo. I will now read another Quranic verse. أَلَمْ يَكُنْ نُطْفَةً مِّن مَّنِيٍّ يُمْنَىٰ ثُمَّ كَانَ عَلَقَةً فَخَلَقَ فَسَوَّىٰ فَجَعَلَ مِنْهُ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَىٰ. Was he not a drop of sperm emitted in lowly form? Then did he become a clinging clot. Then did Allah make and fashion him in due proportion. And of him he made 2 genders, male and female. Okay, so when it refers to a clinging clot, once again this refers to the zygote. Then did Allah make and fashion him in due proportion. So this refers to the different body structures that we see. So each part of the body, like for example, you have the arms, the legs, the hips, the head, and all of these are made and they're basically proportional to one another. So I'm going to give some examples to you. So for example, if you measure your height and you measure the length of your head vertically, you will notice that 6 or 7 of your heads will equal your height. 2, if you measure your wingspan, it should be approximately like the same measurement as your height. And ultimately it says he made 2 genders, male and female. So these are determined by characteristics that you see in the embryo. So testes in the male, and the male genitals, and then the female genitals, that determines your gender. Next, we have another Quranic ayah. الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك. Him who created thee, fashioned thee in due proportion, and gave thee a just bias in whatever form he wills, does he put thee together. So once again, it talks about due proportion, and I mentioned some previously. So this ayah is really similar to the last ayah that I just said. So now we will be moving on to senses. So 2 that I will be talking about are hearing and sight. So I will read another Quranic verse. وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. And he gave you the faculties of hearing and sight and feeling and understanding. So the way this is worded, it goes in order of which senses form. So in order. So first the ears form, and this is formed using the bones that I mentioned previously. So there are 3 bones that are in the ear that facilitate hearing. So those are the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. So those are some of the key components that you need in the ear, and other components, but those are some. Next we have sight. So when the embryo is originally or when the fetus is first developing, in place of eyes we have these small black dots, and it basically houses things like the cornea, the retina. Ultimately it will also house cones and rods, and also the thing that gives it its shape and its crystal-like appearance is a protein called crystallin. And lastly we have feeling. So this is the 4th stage that happens during fetal development, and it's called neuralization. And this is a process where a bunch of neurons and other things like that form in the fetus. So ultimately we will have sensory proteins, not sensory proteins, we will have things like the neural tube. So the neural tube is what will turn into the brain. We will also have nerves in our in areas like our fingertips, and it'll allow us to feel things, and this ayah mentions that. I will now read another ayah. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. Verily we created man from a drop of mingled sperm in order to try him. So we gave him the gifts of hearing and sight. So once again, this is similar to the previous ayah. It talks about the gift of hearing and sight. And now the last ayah that I will read. وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنشَأَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. It is he who has created for you the faculties of hearing, sight, feeling, and understanding. Little things it is ye give. So once again, this is an ayah that was mentioned previously, and it also talks about hearing, sight, feeling, and understanding. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Brother Tahmin Chowdhury, for giving us such an educated and knowledgeable input on the embryonic stages, embryology altogether. Alhamdulillah, we've learned a lot that the Quran presented the formation of a human body much before the Quran was actually, much before we had ultrasound to discover the actual processes of how it was made.